Sarah had been acting strange for weeks, maybe even months, but I hadn't thought much of it at first. We'd been married for 8 years, and I was used to the occasional odd mood. Stress from work, family stuff, the usual. But this felt different. It was subtle at first, late nights at work, quiet phone calls she would step outside to take, excuses that seemed rehearsed. Then came the pills. It was early morning when I first saw them. Sarah had been in the bathroom longer than usual, and I was getting ready for work. As I walked past the open door, I saw her hastily shoving a bottle back into her purse. She glanced up, and her expression changed, surprised, almost guilty, but she quickly masked it with a tired smile. "What's that?" I asked casually, pointing to her bag. "Oh, just some vitamins," she mumbled, zipping her purse shut with a shaky hand. I nodded, pretending to buy her excuse, but the way she avoided my eyes told me she was hiding something. Over the next few days, I started noticing other signs. She was coughing more, taking those pills several times a day, and constantly running to the bathroom. It wasn't like her. Sarah had always been careful about her health. She never even took painkillers unless absolutely necessary. I tried to convince myself that maybe she just didn't want to worry me with a minor health issue. But late at night, as I lay awake next to her, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. 2 weeks passed, and her behavior only grew stranger. She was distracted, on edge, and she seemed to be avoiding me more and more. She'd come home late from work, claiming she had meetings or traffic had been terrible. She spent less time at home, and when she was here, she'd retreat to the bedroom or the bathroom for long stretches. One night, I watched her sneak out to the car, clutching her purse tightly. My curiosity got the better of me, so I quietly followed her outside. She sat in the car for what felt like forever, head resting on the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. Eventually, she straightened up, wiped her eyes, and drove off. I decided to follow her. She drove across town, through streets I'd never seen her take before, and finally pulled into the parking lot of a hospital. My stomach dropped. From the distance, I watched as she hurried inside, nervously glancing around like she didn't want to be seen. She stayed inside for nearly an hour. When she finally came out, she was carrying a bag from the pharmacy, her expression tight and anxious. When she got home that evening, she was quieter than usual. I asked her how her day was, and she mumbled something about work before retreating to the bedroom. Later that night, when she was asleep, I snuck into the bathroom and found her purse. Digging through it, I found the bag from the pharmacy, stuffed with more pills. The name on the bottle wasn't a regular over-the-counter drug. It was Augmentin, a strong antibiotic. I stared at the label, my mind racing. I looked up the drug and found that it was used to treat various infections, some of them intimate. My heart sank. Why was Sarah taking this, and why was she hiding it from me? I decided not to confront her right away. I needed more information, something solid to understand what was happening. My instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong, but I wasn't ready to confront the possibilities that swirled in my head. I needed proof, not just suspicions. The following day, Sarah's odd behavior continued. She stayed on her phone constantly, whispering into it when she thought I wasn't paying attention. She was jumpy and easily startled, especially when I got too close. That evening, I watched her step outside to make another hushed call, her voice low and tense. The next morning, when she left the house, I finally took the plunge. I ordered a set of cameras online, small enough to hide around the house without her noticing. I knew it was extreme, but I needed answers. If Sarah was hiding something, I was going to find out. I didn't know what I would uncover, but whatever it was, I was sure of one thing. This was just the beginning. The cameras arrived a few days later. I installed them in strategic spots, one in the living room, another in the kitchen, and a third in the bedroom. I placed them carefully, hidden among decorations and behind shelves, ensuring Sarah wouldn't notice. It felt wrong, invasive even, but my mind was spiraling with so many unanswered questions. I needed to know what she was doing when I wasn't around. The first few days of filming revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Sarah was just going about her business, sometimes masturbating, talking on the phone for hours, and taking pills. She seemed more anxious than ever, her eyes darting around as if constantly waiting for something or someone. She would occasionally pace the room, whispering frantically on her phone. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her expression was filled with dread. After another week of watching the uneventful footage, I decided to up my game. I needed to cover more ground. I bought a dashcam for her car, small enough to blend in with the clutter she already kept on the dashboard. I installed it one evening when she was out with friends, one of her rare social outings lately. My gut told me that her car would reveal more than the house ever could. 3 days later, I retrieved the footage. Sitting in my office with the door locked, I plugged the dashcam into my laptop and hit play. At first, it was the same old routine. Sarah driving to work, stopping at the grocery store and running errands. But then there was something different. She drove farther out of town than she ever had before, taking a secluded route that led to a quiet park on the outskirts of the city. She parked and stayed there for a while, staring at her phone. The camera picked up her voice, soft but frantic. She wasn't talking to me, that much was clear. She was yelling into the phone, her voice breaking with anger and fear. "I can't believe you did this to me," she sobbed, her words sharp and filled with regret. "You said it was safe. You promised." She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end, then burst into tears. "It's not just some minor thing. I'm seeing doctors, taking pills. I don't even know how to tell him." My heart pounded as I listened, each word confirming my worst fears. She wasn't talking to a friend, she was talking to him, whoever he was. She spoke about some infection, something serious that wasn't going away. I felt sick, realizing that she had risked everything, our marriage, our life together, for this. The footage continued as she called someone else, her voice cracking. "I don't know what to do. It's getting worse. I went to see the urologist again, and it's not going away." Her tone shifted from anger to panic. "I never should have done this. I don't even know how to tell him. I'm so scared." The conversation ended abruptly, and Sarah just sat there, crying in her car. She stayed like that for a long time, gripping the steering wheel and muttering to herself about how stupid she had been, how she wished she could take it all back. Then, with a heavy sigh, she wiped her tears and drove home, putting on her usual mask of calm before stepping back into our house. That night, she acted as if everything was normal, asking me about my day as if her world wasn't falling apart. But I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I now knew she was hiding a massive secret, something far worse than I had ever imagined. My mind raced with questions. Who was she seeing, and how did she end up in this mess? But instead of confronting her, I kept my calm, knowing that this was only the beginning of what I would uncover. I needed to be smart, careful. I needed to know every last detail before making my move. As she kissed me goodnight, I turned away, my mind already working on my next steps. I reviewed the footage over and over, listening to every word she said. The infection she mentioned wasn't just any infection, it was something rare and persistent, something that wouldn't go away easily. I realized that whatever disease she had contracted was serious, and she was terrified of how it was progressing. She had risked everything, and now she was paying the price. But she wasn't the only one who would face consequences. I decided that I wasn't going to be the fool in this situation. I was done being in the dark. My anger simmered quietly, fueled by her lies and the deceit that had infiltrated our home. This was no longer just about an affair. It was about betrayal on a level I couldn't have imagined. I started to plan my next move. If she thought she could lie to me and get away with it, she was wrong. I would let her dig her own grave. And once I had everything I needed, I would show her just how much she had underestimated me. I spent the next few days replaying Sarah's frantic calls in my mind. I wanted to confront her immediately, to scream at her and demand answers. But I knew that rushing in blind wouldn't get me the closure or satisfaction I craved. I needed to be calm, calculated, and cold. My next move was to make Sarah confess without me having to say a word. The footage I had was damning, but I needed her guilt to weigh her down until she couldn't take it anymore. I started leaving subtle hints around the house. I'd casually bring up health-related articles on my laptop when she was in the room, pausing on stories about infections that mirrored what she was going through. I left the pill bottle out on the counter one morning, pretending to have found it by accident. "Hey, you left this out," I said, feigning casual indifference. Sarah's face paled as she snatched the bottle from my hand, mumbling something about needing to keep things organized. Her hands were trembling. She was slipping, and I could see the fear in her eyes. That night, I overheard her whispering on the phone again, sounding more desperate than ever. He's starting to notice. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the dashcam footage, her voice echoing in my head. The infection, the pills, the strange man she was yelling at, it all pointed to one thing. Sarah had cheated, and it had backfired on her in the worst way. I wondered how long she would keep hiding it. But then again, I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. I wanted her to drown in her own guilt first. One evening, I returned home from work earlier than usual. Sarah was in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, lost in her thoughts. She barely noticed when I sat down next to her. We made small talk, but I could tell she wasn't paying attention. She looked worn down, tired, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound genuinely concerned. "You've seemed a little off lately." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired, that's all. Work's been crazy." I nodded, pretending to accept her lie. "I've noticed you've been taking a lot of medication. Is everything all right?" Her face tightened, and for a moment, I thought she was going to tell me. But instead, she waved it off. "Oh, it's nothing serious. Just something minor. I'm fine." I stared at her, watching the way she avoided my gaze. "If it's nothing, then why hide it? I've seen the pills, Sarah. Augmentin isn't something you take for a cold." Sarah's eyes widened, and she visibly tensed. She was caught off guard, scrambling for a response. "I told you it's nothing. A friend of mine is sick, and I've been picking up her prescriptions. It's really not a big deal." Her lie was so flimsy that it almost made me laugh. "Your friend, huh? You've been acting strange for weeks, and I've seen you sneaking around. You think I don't notice when you disappear to the bathroom with your phone or leave the house without telling me where you're going?" Sarah's face turned red, anger and panic mixing in her expression. "I don't know what you're talking about." I leaned back, pretending to let it go. "All right if you say so. But if there's something you're not telling me, now would be the time to come clean." She said nothing. The silence between us grew heavy, and I could feel her anxiety filling the room. I stood up, shaking my head in mock disappointment, and left her sitting there, guilt slowly eating away at her. That night, Sarah barely spoke to me. She tossed and turned in bed, her anxiety palpable. I knew she was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before she would break. But I didn't want her confession just yet. I wanted her to suffer in silence for a little longer. The next day, I made my move. I decided to push her further. I set up my laptop on the kitchen table and pulled up the dashcam footage, letting it play just loud enough for Sarah to hear when she came downstairs. I watched her freeze at the sound of her own voice, screaming into the phone. She was frantic, desperate, crying about the infection and how it was ruining everything. Sarah stopped in the doorway, her face draining of color. What is this?" she stammered, her eyes glued to the screen. I didn't look up. "Found it in your car. Interesting, isn't it?" She stood there, unable to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She was cornered, and she knew it. I finally turned to face her, letting the anger I had kept buried for weeks surface. "You've been lying to me, Sarah. Who is he? Who gave you that infection?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she crumbled onto the kitchen chair, her resolve finally breaking. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she choked out, but I wasn't moved. "You risked everything, Sarah. For what? A fling with some stranger? And now you're bringing home diseases? Do you have any idea what you've done?" She didn't respond, just cried harder, her body shaking. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and fury. I had waited for this moment, but seeing her like this didn't bring the relief I thought it would. Instead, it just made me feel more determined. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of her downfall. I turned away, leaving her sobbing at the kitchen table. I packed a bag and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I needed space, time to clear my head and decide what to do next. But one thing was for sure, Sarah would pay for what she did, and this was only the start of her regret. 2 days passed since I walked out of the house, and I stayed at a hotel to gather my thoughts. The anger and betrayal coursed through me like a poison I couldn't flush out. Sarah had tried calling me multiple times, her messages a mix of tearful apologies and desperate pleas for me to come home. Each time my phone buzzed, I ignored it, letting her words go unheard. I wanted her to feel alone and abandoned, just as I had felt when I discovered the truth. On the third day, I decided it was time to put my plan into action. I didn't want to be the victim in this story. I wanted to hit back, to make her feel the sting of betrayal that I had felt. But I didn't want it to be simple. I wanted her to suffer slowly, just like she had made me. So, I began plotting my next move, revenge, with a twist she wouldn't see coming. While browsing through my messages, I noticed a missed call from Melissa, Sarah's closest friend. Melissa had been a constant presence in our lives, a little too constant if I was being honest. She was always nosy, always knew too much. And she had a way of comforting Sarah whenever things went south. I suddenly realized that if anyone knew more about Sarah's affair, it would be her. Curiosity got the better of me and I called Melissa back. She answered on the first ring, her voice filled with a mix of concern and guilt. "Hey, I've been trying to reach you. Are you okay?" I could hear the worry in her tone, but there was something else there too, something hesitant. It wasn't just sympathy, it was the sound of someone who knew more than they were letting on. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Just needed some space." Melissa sighed, her voice softening. "I'm so sorry truly. I've wanted to tell you for so long, but I didn't know how. Sarah, she messed up big time." Her admission caught me off guard. I hadn't expected her to be so direct. "So you knew?" I asked, letting my anger seep into the words. "You knew she was cheating, and you didn't think to tell me?" Melissa's voice wavered. "I wanted to, believe me, but she's my best friend. I kept hoping she'd come to her senses and fix things before it went this far." I let her words hang in the air, the silence thick and uncomfortable. I could sense her guilt, and I knew I could use it to my advantage. "Meet me," I said finally. "We need to talk." We met later that afternoon at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Melissa looked nervous, her eyes darting around as if she were afraid Sarah might walk in at any moment. She apologized profusely, saying she felt trapped between her loyalty to Sarah and her conscience. I listened patiently, pretending to be sympathetic, but inside, my mind was working out how I could use her. Melissa confessed more than I expected. She told me how Sarah had met the guy at a work event and that it started as harmless flirting that quickly escalated. Sarah had been swept up in the thrill of something new, blinded by the attention and the promises he made. But when things went south, when the infection started, Melissa became Sarah's confidant, coaching her on how to hide it. "She didn't mean for any of this to happen," Melissa said, her voice tinged with regret. "She's been a mess ever since." I watched her closely, seeing an opportunity in her guilt. Melissa wasn't just complicit, she was a way in, a tool I could use to make Sarah's life even more miserable. As she continued talking, I leaned in, my expression softening. "It's hard to know who to trust now," I said, letting the vulnerability creep into my voice. "Sarah betrayed me and now I don't know where to go from here." Melissa reached out, touching my hand gently. "You don't deserve this. You've been nothing but good to her." I could see the empathy in her eyes, and I knew I had her hooked. She wanted to help me, maybe out of guilt, maybe because she felt responsible, but either way, it played perfectly into my hands. I pretended to be lost, vulnerable, and desperate for comfort. And Melissa, eager to make amends, was more than willing to give it. Over the next few weeks, I kept in touch with Melissa, sharing just enough about my feelings to keep her invested. We started meeting more frequently, sometimes for coffee, other times for drinks. Our conversations grew more personal, and Melissa became my confidant in ways Sarah never was. I played the part of the wounded husband perfectly, and Melissa was always there to listen, to offer a shoulder to lean on. But it wasn't just her friendship I was after. I knew she was Sarah's closest ally, and I wanted to see just how far that loyalty went. One night, after a few too many drinks, Melissa leaned in closer than she ever had before, her touch lingering on my arm. There was something more behind her gaze, a spark that wasn't just friendly. "You don't have to go through this alone," she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "I'm here for you, whatever you need." It was the opening I had been waiting for. I leaned in, closing the distance between us, and kissed her. It was a reckless, impulsive move, but it was also calculated. I wanted her to cross that line, to betray Sarah the same way Sarah had betrayed me. And Melissa didn't pull away. She kissed me back, her guilt melting into desire. We ended up at my hotel room that night, crossing every line that had once seemed so unthinkable. As Melissa slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was part of my revenge, not just on Sarah, but on everyone who had been complicit in her lies. I wasn't just going to hurt Sarah, I was going to destroy the very foundations of her world. Melissa woke up before dawn, looking conflicted but not regretful. "We should keep this between us," she said softly, biting her lip. "Sarah's already dealing with so much." I nodded, but inside I was smiling. This was just the beginning. Sarah's web of lies had tangled more people than she realized, and now I was going to use every thread to unravel her life completely. I returned home a few days later, determined to keep up the facade of the wounded husband while my plans unfolded behind the scenes. Sarah greeted me nervously, her eyes red from crying, her demeanor broken and contrite. She had spent the days I was gone sending me messages and leaving voicemails, all begging for forgiveness, all filled with empty promises that she would make things right. But I wasn't interested in her apologies. I was interested in making her pay. She tiptoed around me, trying to be the perfect wife. She cooked my favorite meals, cleaned obsessively, and avoided any confrontation, terrified that I might leave again. But every time she looked at me, I saw the fear in her eyes, the fear that I would never truly forgive her, that I knew more than I let on. And she was right. Meanwhile, my encounters with Melissa continued. We met in secret, slipping into hotel rooms and back alleys, our trysts fueled by a mix of lust, anger, and revenge. Melissa was playing with fire, but she couldn't seem to stop herself, and neither could I. Every time we met, it was like another nail in Sarah's coffin. I kept pushing, drawing Melissa further into my world, making her an accomplice to my schemes. It wasn't just about the physical affair. It was about taking something that belonged to Sarah and turning it against her. Melissa had always been Sarah's rock, her most trusted confidant, and now, she was mine. I filled Melissa's head with stories about how much Sarah had hurt me, how deeply her betrayal had cut. And Melissa, eager to help and prove her loyalty, became more than willing to join my cause. We started planning ways to get back at Sarah. Melissa told me everything, about the other man, the lies, the excuses Sarah had used to keep the affair hidden. She even showed me the messages Sarah had sent her, filled with panic and regret, asking for advice on how to make things right with me. I read every word, savoring the desperation in Sarah's pleas. She had no idea how deeply she was being betrayed from every angle. One night, I asked Melissa to take things a step further. "I want Sarah to know she's lost everything," I said, my voice cold and deliberate. "I want her to see that she has no one left." Melissa hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "Are you sure? I mean, she's already on the edge." "That's exactly where I want her," I replied, unmoved. "I want her to feel what it's like to lose everything, just like she made me feel." Melissa nodded, reluctantly agreeing. I could see the conflict in her eyes. She still cared about Sarah, but my grip on her was too strong now. She was caught in the crossfire, and there was no going back. Over the next week, Melissa began to distance herself from Sarah. She stopped returning her calls, ignored her messages, and gradually pulled away, leaving Sarah increasingly isolated. Sarah noticed, of course. She would come home looking more lost than ever, and her attempts to reconnect with Melissa were met with silence. I could see the confusion and hurt in her eyes, but she was too ashamed to ask me about it. She knew she had burned bridges, and now, they were collapsing around her. I continued to manipulate Melissa, pulling her closer even as she pushed Sarah away. We met more frequently, and our encounters grew bolder. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control, about watching Sarah's world crumble while I stood on the sidelines, orchestrating every downfall. One afternoon, Melissa and I met for lunch, and she brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. "Sarah's not doing well," she said, almost as if she were seeking my approval. "She's been talking about how she feels like she's losing everything. I don't know if I can keep this up." I leaned in, my tone firm. "You're doing great. This is exactly what needs to happen. She needs to hit rock bottom." Melissa nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. I reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You're doing this for me and I appreciate it. We're in this together." That night, Sarah tried to reach out to Melissa again, and I watched her crumble when she received no response. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I could feel the tension radiating off her, the realization that she was alone sinking in deeper. I seized the moment, walking into the room and sitting across from her. "You look upset," I said, feigning concern. "Did something happen?" Sarah hesitated, clearly debating whether to confide in me. I don't know what's going on with Melissa. She's been so distant lately. I feel like I've lost her too." I pretended to be sympathetic, nodding slowly. "Maybe she's just busy. People change." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, and she shook her head. "I've messed everything up. I thought I could fix this, but now I'm losing everyone I care about." I watched her break down, her sobs echoing through the quiet house. For a brief moment, I almost felt pity for her, almost. But then I remembered the lies, the deceit, and the infection she had brought into our lives. She didn't deserve my pity, she deserved everything that was coming to her. As Sarah continued to cry, I stood up and left the room, leaving her to drown in her guilt. This was exactly where I wanted her, broken, alone, and on the verge of losing everything she once held dear. But I wasn't finished yet. My revenge wasn't complete until she knew the full extent of her downfall. I returned to Melissa the next day, ready to take things further. I needed her to be my final weapon, the one that would deliver the last blow. I had started something I couldn't stop, and I wasn't going to walk away until Sarah was left with nothing but her regrets. Over the next few days, I could sense the walls closing in on Sarah. She was unraveling faster than I'd expected, and every attempt she made to reach out for help was met with silence or rejection. Melissa's continued absence hit her the hardest. Sarah had never been without her best friend's support, and now, that lifeline was severed. It was exactly what I wanted, for Sarah to feel the full weight of her actions without anyone to soften the blow. But I wasn't done. There was one more move to make, the final piece of the puzzle that would ensure Sarah's world collapsed completely. I had been holding on to it, waiting for the perfect moment. And now, as she grew more desperate and alone, that moment had arrived. I arranged to meet Melissa again, this time at the same cafe where we had first plotted against Sarah. She seemed more conflicted than ever, torn between her lingering loyalty to Sarah and the thrill of our secret alliance. But today, I was ready to push her past that hesitation. Today, I was going to bring our plan to its devastating conclusion. "Sarah's been calling me non-stop," Melissa said, stirring her coffee nervously. "I think she's starting to figure out that something's wrong. She asked me outright if I was avoiding her." I leaned back, studying her face. Melissa was cracking, just like Sarah, and I needed her to stay strong for just a little while longer. "She needs to understand what it's like to lose everything," I said calmly. "She needs to feel the consequences of her choices." Melissa bit her lip, looking unsure. "I don't know how much more of this I can take. She's my friend, or at least she was." I reached out, touching her hand reassuringly. "We're almost there. Just one last thing, and then you can walk away. I promise." Melissa hesitated, but eventually nodded. She was in too deep to back out now, and she knew it. I gave her the details of my plan. A small gathering at my house, something low-key and informal. I told her I wanted to confront Sarah with the truth, to lay everything out in the open once and for all. But what Melissa didn't know was that she was about to become a key player in the most devastating twist of all. The night of the gathering, I told Sarah that Melissa had finally agreed to come over. It was the first time I'd seen a glimmer of hope in Sarah's eyes in weeks. She rushed to get ready, fixing her hair and putting on makeup as if that could somehow erase all the damage that had been done. She was desperate to make amends, and the thought of seeing Melissa seemed like her last chance. Melissa arrived shortly after, dressed in casual clothes that did little to hide her nervousness. Sarah greeted her at the door, tears welling up as she pulled her into a tight hug. "I've missed you so much," Sarah choked out, her voice breaking. Melissa hugged her back, but her smile was thin and strained. "Yeah, I've missed you too." We all sat in the living room, and for a moment, there was an awkward silence. Sarah tried to make small talk, asking about Melissa's work, her family, anything to fill the uncomfortable gaps. But Melissa's responses were short, and the tension in the room grew thicker with every passing second. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She looked at Melissa, her eyes pleading. "I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you and everyone around me, but I'm trying to make things right. I need you." Melissa glanced at me, unsure of what to say. I gave her a slight nod, signaling it was time to move forward. "Sarah, there's something you need to know," I said, breaking the silence. "Something about Melissa and me." Sarah looked confused, her eyes darting between the two of us. "What do you mean?" I stood up, pacing the room slowly, letting the suspense build. "You've been hiding secrets from me for months, Sarah. But you're not the only one who's been hiding something." I turned to Melissa, who was visibly trembling now. "Tell her." Melissa hesitated, her face pale. But I kept my gaze on her, and she finally caved, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been seeing each other since you told me about the affair." The shock on Sarah's face was immediate. She blinked, as if trying to process what she'd just heard. What are you talking about?" I stepped closer, my expression hardening. "Melissa and I have been having an affair, Sarah. While you were busy with your lies, I found comfort somewhere else. With your best friend." Sarah's face twisted in disbelief, and she shook her head, as if trying to deny the reality unfolding in front of her. "No, you're lying. Melissa, please tell me this isn't true." But Melissa couldn't even look her in the eye. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry." Sarah stumbled back, her hand covering her mouth as she let out a choked sob. She was devastated, blindsided by the ultimate betrayal. The two people she had leaned on the most, the two people she thought she could trust, had turned against her in the cruelest way possible. "You took everything from me," I said coldly, watching as Sarah broke down. "You threw our marriage away for some random guy, and now you've lost your best friend too. This is what it feels like, Sarah. This is what you've done to yourself." Sarah collapsed onto the couch, crying uncontrollably. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left for her to say, no excuses or explanations that could undo what she had done. She was completely alone, and the realization of it crushed her. I turned to leave, motioning for Melissa to follow. As we walked out the door, I glanced back at Sarah one last time. She was a shell of the woman I once knew, lost, broken, and drowning in the mess she had created. Melissa hesitated at the doorway, casting one final, regretful look at Sarah. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but it was too late. The damage was done. We left Sarah behind, shutting the door on the life we once shared. I knew that my revenge was complete, and I felt a twisted satisfaction knowing that Sarah would live with this pain for the rest of her life. She had made her choices, and now she was paying the price. But as we walked away, I also knew that nothing would ever be the same. I had destroyed Sarah, but in the process, I had lost pieces of myself too. This wasn't the end I had imagined, but it was the one I had crafted, one where betrayal met betrayal, and no one walked away unscathed. The days that followed were a haze of mixed emotions. I had gotten the revenge I craved, but the satisfaction was fleeting, quickly replaced by a hollow feeling that lingered. Sarah's breakdown at our confrontation replayed in my mind over and over, her sobs, her pleas, the sheer disbelief in her eyes as she realized that the people she trusted most had turned against her. It was exactly what I had planned, and yet, it didn't feel like a victory. Melissa and I continued to meet, but something had shifted between us. The thrill of our secret encounters had dulled, overshadowed by the guilt that hung heavy in the air. Melissa was quieter now, more withdrawn, and I could tell she was struggling to come to terms with what we had done. Every time we were together, I could see the conflict in her eyes, the torn loyalty, the regret that she tried to hide but couldn't completely bury. One night, as we lay side by side in a dimly lit hotel room, Melissa finally broke the silence. "This isn't what I wanted," she whispered, staring up at the ceiling. I thought it would feel better than this." I turned to face her, seeing the pain etched on her face. For the first time, I saw past the anger that had driven me for so long and recognized that Melissa was just as broken as Sarah. She had been caught in a game she never really wanted to play, and now, the weight of it all was crushing her. "It was never supposed to be this way," I admitted, my voice heavy with the truth I had been avoiding. "I wanted to hurt Sarah, but I didn't think about what it would do to us." Melissa sat up, pulling the sheets around her like a shield. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she said softly. "I betrayed my best friend. I hurt her in ways I can't even understand." She paused, her eyes brimming with tears, and I realized that this wasn't just about Sarah or me. It was about the irreversible damage we had done to everyone involved. I had set out to destroy Sarah, but in the process, I had wrecked so much more. Melissa and I stopped seeing each other after that night. The affair that had started as a twisted means of revenge now felt like a mistake neither of us wanted to confront. We went our separate ways, and I was left alone with the aftermath of my actions. The house felt emptier than ever, filled with memories that haunted me at every turn. Sarah, on the other hand, had completely withdrawn from the world. She spent most of her days in the bedroom, barely eating or speaking. She had tried reaching out to Melissa a few more times, but each attempt was met with silence. I knew she was drowning in regret, but there was no part of me that wanted to save her. This was her mess to clean up, and I was done playing the role of her rescuer. One afternoon, I found Sarah sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by old photo albums. She was flipping through pictures of us, of vacations, holidays, moments that once meant something. Her eyes were puffy and red, her expression distant and lost. "Why are you looking at those?" I asked, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. Sarah looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm just trying to remember what it felt like when we were happy." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Those days are gone, Sarah. You made sure of that." She flinched at my words, but she didn't argue. She just stared at the photos, tracing her fingers over the images of our past. "I know I've ruined everything. I've lost you, I've lost Melissa. I've lost everything that mattered." There was a rawness in her voice that almost made me feel something, almost. But I couldn't let myself soften. "Not now. You threw it all away," I said coldly. "For what? A fling with some guy who didn't even care about you?" Sarah broke down, sobbing into her hands. I watched her crumble, feeling no satisfaction, only emptiness. This wasn't the revenge I had imagined. It was messy, painful, and it had left me with nothing but the ruins of a life I no longer recognized. Weeks passed, and our home became a battlefield of silence. We rarely spoke, and when we did, it was only out of necessity. Sarah had started seeing a therapist, trying to piece together the fragments of her shattered life, but I could see that it was a long road ahead. She was a shadow of the woman I once knew, trapped in a cycle of guilt and self-loathing. As for me, I found myself drifting through each day, struggling to find purpose. The anger that had fueled me was gone, replaced by a numbness that I couldn't shake. I had built my revenge around the idea that it would bring me closure, but instead, it had only left me feeling more lost. I thought back to the man I used to be, the husband who trusted, who believed in his marriage, who had a future that felt secure. That man was gone, buried beneath the wreckage of Sarah's betrayal and my own choices. One evening, I came home to find a letter on the kitchen table. It was from Sarah, her handwriting shaky and uneven. She wrote about her regrets, her sorrow, and her hope that someday I would be able to forgive her, even if she could never forgive herself. It was a goodbye letter, one that marked the end of our time together. She was leaving, going to stay with her sister in another state, where she could try to start over. I read the letter twice, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. This was the end of the life we had built, and there was no going back. I didn't stop her when she packed her things and walked out the door. I just watched, letting her go without a word. This was what she wanted, a chance to escape the consequences of her actions. And maybe, in a way, it was what I needed too. Sarah's departure left the house even quieter, emptier. I stood in the living room, staring at the spot where she had sat with those photo albums, and I realized that I had finally gotten what I wanted. Sarah was gone, Melissa was gone, and I was free. But freedom didn't feel the way I thought it would. It felt like loss, like the kind of emptiness you can't fill. I poured myself a drink and sat down, letting the silence settle around me. The revenge was over, the battle won, but it felt more like a hollow victory. I had destroyed Sarah, but I had also destroyed myself in the process. And as I sat there, alone in the dim light of our once shared home, I understood that sometimes, revenge leaves you with nothing but ashes. In the end, there were no winners. Only the broken pieces of what once was scattered and irreparable. I took a long sip of my drink, staring into the darkness, knowing that some wounds never truly heal.